kids who were going to be dead tomorrow and the next day and the next day.
During the mid-1980s, serial killers were already a staple of American media. Everybody knew the names of Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Richard Ramirez, and others, while murderers like Jeffrey Dahmer, the as-of-then unknown BTK, and the Green River Killer were just entering the true crime pop culture lexicon. But America wasn't the only country with serial killers, though because of how the media operated on human tragedy, how it continues to operate today in the Western world, it was the country on which the spotlight most often fell. In September 1986, South Korea began experiencing their first identifiable string of serial killings. From 1986 until 1991, in the city of Hwaseong, Gyeonggi, there were 10 rape and murders involving women strangled with items of their own clothing. While the Federal Bureau of Investigation in America were familiar with these types of crimes, and the Behavioral Analysis Unit had begun to specialize in psychological profiling geared towards repeat killers specifically, South Korea had no such experience. It wasn't only a case of detectives unprepared for the gruesome nature of these murders, it was an overall lack of preparedness on the part of the legal system and its various cogs in dealing with the procedure necessary to investigate serial killings. This extended from a lack of understanding in regards to the psychological aspects of these crimes to the damaging public chaos which erupted at the crime scenes. Sadly, police weren't capable of generating any significant leads, due in part to their own naivety about how to treat a suspect, as well as a number of contaminated crime scenes. The murderer was not caught until recently. And until recently, many considered the unsolved Hwaseong murders to be the Asian equivalent of the Zodiac Killer's reign of terror throughout Northern California nearly 2 decades earlier in America. Bong Joon-ho's 2003 film Memories of Murder takes a fictional look at the police investigation in Hwaseong, examining all the ways it went wrong and the lasting impact this case had on South Korea as a whole. Bong dives headfirst into all the ways South Korean police were ill-prepared to deal with modern crimes when they were stuck in a somewhat pre-modern iteration of investigation, sometimes by choice. The screenplay uses the character of Inspector Park Do-man as a way of showing how the country wasn't used to sophisticated crimes, resulting in decidedly unsophisticated policing. For instance, Park insists he's able to suss out a suspect's true nature through eye contact, and during several scenes he employs this method hoping to somehow identify the serial killer he's seeking with an impromptu staring contest. He's symbolic of an old way of thinking, not unlike the same attitudes we see from Canadian conservatives and American Republicans. Criminals look like criminals. He tells one of his fellow policemen, "But my eyes can't be fooled." The screenplay also juxtaposes Inspector Shao Tae-yoon, a cop from Seoul, with Park-style policing as representative of a more modern style. Seoul's population is a few 100,000 people shy of a population around 10 million, whereas Hwaseong, though a city, has only 750,000 citizens. It's like in an American movie where a detective from New York City travels to a small southern city to investigate a crime, situating Seo as a sophisticated modern inspector versus Park's backwoods-type cop. Seo is less inclined to take suspects at face value, using more cerebral methods to narrow down the suspect pool. He pays attention to the modus operandi of the killings instead of seeking out the weirdest-looking person who's easiest to pin the crimes on. One hilarious subplot has Park following his own modern instincts by insisting that due to a lack of pubic hairs found at the crime scenes, the culprit must be a total baldy. This prompts him to go undercover at the local bathhouses, where he scans the room casually hoping to find a man with no pubic hair. Later, he resorts to a psychic in his desperation as well, not unlike many cops in America have. He does come to an understanding that his methods are ineffective, only that arrives too late. The film's closing moments show Park recognizing his eyes were fooled all along. He speaks with a little girl who may have seen the suspect return years later to one of the crime scenes, and she tells him the man looked ordinary and plain. Park finally sees there was no way to pick the right suspect out of a crowd, then breaks the fourth wall silently by staring directly into the camera as the screen fades to black. This gesture is an acknowledgement by Bong as director that the suspect could be somebody out there watching the film in real life. And simultaneously, Park searches the audience, lost in an endless sea of potential suspects. In the film, although the incompetence of South Korean authorities is on full display, the screenplay makes significant connections between American and South Korean police, as well as the media in both countries. Bong's film does a great job of presenting the real Hwaseong case in a familiar way to American films about police investigations. He shows how police work can be inherently corrupt. It's not just an American thing. Early in the film, Inspector Park and his partner Inspector Cho Young-koo beat a mentally challenged, disfigured man they believe responsible for the crimes, simply because Park's wife says the man followed one of the victims before she was killed. They confine him to a basement and lead him with questions into confessing to one of the murders. Initially, the suspect's charged, and Bong perfectly depicts the hubris of police after falsely obtaining a confession when Cho and Park happily have their picture taken with their sergeant for a newspaper. All three men stand in single file on the stairs with big smiles, holding up their fists in victory. After the first suspect is proved innocent, another man is beaten into confession by Park and Cho. In this scene, a boiler man comes and goes checking the furnace in the basement as the two detectives conduct light torture on their suspect. This seemingly innocuous moment is indicative of police corruption as an everyday common occurrence, not something that rarely happens. Nowadays, after the Paradise Lost documentaries, as well as most recently stuff like Making a Murderer and others, the forced confession often has a specifically American face in the media. Bong's film shows how the nature of police work, especially concerning difficult and disturbing cases such as the Hwaseong murders, can lead those meant to uphold the law to break it under the dangerously misguided notion they're putting an immoral killer behind bars. Normal crime scenes are presented as absolute chaos in South Korea. After the first murder, Park's trying to gather evidence and must contend with the media snapping pictures, children walking through the scene, and even a tractor that runs over a footprint left in nearby mud. It doesn't help that Park keeps a pair of shoes, possible evidence, in the front seat of his car where there exists no official chain of custody, nor any preventative measures to keep DNA or trace evidence found on the shoes intact until they're examined in a lab. As if a regular crime scene with its many problems isn't enough, sometimes murders in South Korea are reenacted. The accused is trotted through the actual location where they dumped a corpse in order for police to get a sense of what their suspect actually knows, or possibly what they don't know, which could ideally lead them towards a more viable suspect. What can, and often does happen, is the police use reenactments to make a suspect look guilty when there's otherwise a lack of evidence. This further shows the inexperience of South Korea police in dealing with sensitive cases, because media are present and photographs of a suspect role-playing the crime wind up on the news. As is shown during a reenactment in the film, these crime scenes are open to the media and often the public. When the first suspected killer is taken to reenact the crime in a field, his father rushes in and causes an absolute commotion while police fight off reporters, and the only thing holding anyone back from the scene itself are a number of people linked arm in arm as if they're playing a game of Red Rover. Herein lies a glaring problem with these reenactments. Although done with good intentions, sometimes, They make a serious crime such as murder appear like a game, or a facade, or something that's being acted out. Memories of Murder explores how South Korean cops weren't only finding it difficult to adjust their ways of thinking to modern murder cases, they were hindered by a lack of technology. A telling moment in the screenplay about the limits of South Korean murder investigations at the time of the murders involves DNA. When the police are excited to finally have a DNA sample from a crime scene they can compare against samples taken from possible suspects, they're quickly disappointed to learn their country doesn't have the capabilities to analyze the samples themselves. They're forced to send the samples to America. Not only can they not do the tests themselves, they have to wait weeks or longer for the results. Most of the investigation was troubled by the police and their fallible methods, yet Bong's screenplay doesn't stray from making the audience wonder what could have been were the appropriate technology available to police at the time. A climactic scene sees Seo on the precipice of becoming the same kind of cop as Parker Cho, allowing the case to skew his own morality. At that same moment, Park arrives with the DNA analysis received from America. The results dash Seo's last hopes of confirming the murderer, and he decides to believe solely in what instinct tells him. Seo tries to shoot a suspect and Park stops him. Regardless of all the scenes depicting police incompetence, this one tragically illustrates the limitations South Korean inspectors faced, and the extent to which they were pushed when faced with their own inability to solve the murders. The power in Memories of Murder comes from watching the frustration of the inspectors working the case, which becomes the audience's frustration. Inspectors Park and Seo are the focus of the screenplay, and though they represent a dichotomy of outdated policing versus contemporary forensic investigation, they eventually come to share the same struggle of wanting to catch a horrific murderer and rapist. In 2003, Bong's film premiered, and 1 year later a new murder occurred in Hwaseong bearing similarities to the original killings, and that murder had also gone unsolved. When I first wrote the text to this essay, the real Hwaseong murders hadn't been solved, and that was in 2018. Like Inspector Park, who couldn't let go of the case, so was the actual city of Hwaseong gripped by a fear of the killer's return. Whenever women in the city go missing or turn up murdered, people would automatically, perhaps even unconsciously, think of those 10 women whose lives were viciously ended between 1986 and 1991. And when I first wrote this essay, I said, at my closing, there will come a time, as in the Zodiac Killer case, when this murderer will be either too old to kill or presumed dead. And until that day, the people of Hwaseong were going to wonder if that man was out there somewhere, perhaps waiting for his next chance to take a victim. Only a year after I wrote this essay originally, police announced that a man in his 50s, Choon-jae, had been identified as a suspect in the killings. They found DNA from underwear of one of the victims and matched it to Choon-jae. And DNA testing linked him to 4 of the other unsolved serial killings. At the time Choon-jae was identified, he was already serving a life sentence in prison for the rape and murder of his sister-in-law. Originally, Choon-jae denied being involved in the serial murders. But then, on October 2nd, 2019, South Korean police announced that Choon-jae had confessed to killing 14 people, including all 10 of the serial murders. After the arrest, Bong Joon-ho said this: "When I made the film, I was very curious, and I also thought a lot about this murderer. I wondered what he looked like. And then later," he said, "I was able to see a photo of his face, and I think I need more time to really explain my emotions from that. But right now, I'd just like to applaud the police force for their endless effort to find the culprit." And, in closing, at least Hwaseong can sleep in peace now. And hopefully the families of the victims who remained can find some solace in the fact that the man who killed their loved ones will never kill again.